The first time Kyle noticed him, really noticed him, it was a late summer evening. The kind where the air clung to your skin like steam, and every surface glowed with the soft orange haze of the setting sun. He had been coming over to Matt's house for years now. They'd grown up across the street from each other, shared Halloween costumes, scraped knees, breakups, and beer-fueled heart-to-hearts. Their friendship was a constant, familiar safe. And so was Matt's family. His mom, ever cheerful, always offering iced tea or home-baked cookies like a sitcom character. His little sister who disappeared into college life months ago. And then there was Chris, Matt's dad. Chris had always been just that, a dad, the tall, quiet type. Broad-shouldered, polite but distant, always busy fixing something, always smelling faintly of sawdust and cologne. Kyle had never paid much attention, until recently. Maybe it was the way Chris's eyes lingered just a moment too long, or how his laugh sounded deeper, more resonant, when Kyle was the one cracking a joke. Maybe it was the way Kyle had started feeling it. The subtle shift in the air when Chris entered the room, like static crawling along his skin. That evening, Matt had run out to grab food, leaving Kyle behind. Chris had just gotten back from work, still in his slacks and button-up shirt, sleeves rolled, neck open, forearms dusted with a fine sheen of sweat. He walked into the kitchen just as Kyle was filling a glass with water from the fridge. "You staying for dinner?" Chris asked, his voice low and unhurried. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his presence commanding without even trying. "Yeah." Matt ran to get burgers. Kyle replied, turning slightly, glass in hand. Chris nodded, but he didn't look away. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. It had weight, it pulsed with something unsaid. Kyle felt it then. The way Chris's gaze lingered, slow and direct, traveling over him like a hand brushing across his chest. He swallowed and looked away, setting the glass down harder than necessary. "Hot out," Chris said, stepping closer. He opened the freezer, the cool air ghosting between them. Kyle caught the scent of him then. Earthy, clean, like pine and something darker. Something male. "Yeah," Kyle replied, his voice thinner than he'd intended. Chris took an ice cube and pressed it against the inside of his wrist, watching the water drip down his arm. Kyle's eyes followed without meaning to. Chris noticed. "You okay?" Chris asked, his voice softer now, the question laced with something gentler, concern or curiosity. Kyle nodded, just tired. But he wasn't, not really. He was restless, overheated in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was shifting inside him, something quiet but undeniable. He could feel it in his chest, a tightness that deepened when Chris moved closer. Chris stepped in to grab a towel from the drawer beside Kyle. His arm brushed against Kyle's shoulder, bare and warm from the sun. The contact was brief, casual, but Kyle felt it everywhere, an electric trail that curled through his spine and made the hairs on his arms rise. He didn't move. Neither did Chris, not at first. There was no noise in the house but the faint hum of the fridge and the tick of the wall clock. Outside, cicadas buzzed lazily. Inside, everything else was still. Chris turned his head slowly. He was close enough now that Kyle could see the flecks of gray in his short stubble, the crinkle at the edge of his eyes, the faint glint of sweat at his temple. "I've been wondering something," Chris said, his voice barely above a murmur. Kyle's pulse stuttered. "Yeah?" Chris hesitated. His eyes searched Kyle's face like he was looking for permission, or maybe trying to talk himself out of whatever he was about to say. Instead, he smiled. Just a little. Just enough to shift the air again. He looked away and turned on the tap, rinsing his hands slowly, deliberately. Kyle let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When Chris dried his hands, his fingers brushed Kyle's again. Not an accident, not this time. It was light, barely there, but it sent a shock through Kyle's system. He met Chris's gaze, and this time, neither of them looked away. "I should go check the grill," Chris said finally. But he didn't move. He stood there for a moment longer, eyes locked, until a car door slammed outside. They both flinched, just slightly. Matt's voice carried through the screen door a moment later. "Yo, got the food?" Chris stepped back, cleared his throat, and grabbed a beer from the fridge as if nothing had happened. But something had. Kyle stood there, heart racing, skin buzzing, and knew it wasn't over. Whatever this was, it had started. The night moved on with the rhythm of habit. Burgers unwrapped, drinks poured, Matt's playlist buzzing from his phone on the windowsill. They ate at the kitchen island like they always did, laughing at dumb jokes and trash-talking each other over whose fries were better seasoned. On the surface, it was easy. But underneath, Kyle could feel the pulse of what had passed between him and Chris. It didn't go away. It curled itself beneath his skin like heat waiting to be acknowledged. Chris was the same. Calm, casual, that slight smile always at the corner of his mouth. But now Kyle noticed everything. The way Chris's fingers wrapped around his beer bottle. How his eyes would flick to Kyle when Matt wasn't looking. The way his voice dropped lower when he spoke directly to him. It was almost unbearable how easily they pretended nothing was different. Later, after dinner, Matt disappeared upstairs to take a shower. Kyle stayed behind under the pretense of helping clean up. He rinsed the dishes slowly, letting the water run too long, listening for footsteps. The house was quiet again. Chris came back into the kitchen, empty glass in hand. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the sink. Kyle shrugged. "Figured I might as well." Chris stepped beside him, close again, not touching. But the space between them felt charged, like a live wire humming just below the surface. "I like when people don't just leave a mess," Chris said, drying his glass. His voice was low, conversational. But the way he stood just behind Kyle made it feel like something else entirely. Kyle nodded, heart hammering. "Yeah, me too." Chris leaned slightly closer. "You've grown up a lot since you started college." Kyle smiled faintly, not turning. "So I've been told." "No," Chris said. And this time there was something in his voice that made Kyle's breath catch. "Not just physically. You carry yourself differently. You look settled, more sure of yourself." Kyle set the sponge down slowly. His hand was trembling just enough to make him notice it. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just good at pretending." Chris let that hang in the air. Then, after a moment, he placed the dish towel on the counter and stepped closer. Kyle could feel the heat of him now, just behind him. He could smell the faint trace of cologne and sweat and something he couldn't name. "Are you pretending right now?" Chris asked. Kyle turned his head slightly, enough to meet his eyes over his shoulder. The look in Chris's eyes wasn't questioning anymore. It was knowing, focused. A spark pulled taut between them, stretched so thin it felt like breathing too hard might snap it. "I don't know," Kyle said quietly. "Am I?" Chris didn't answer. Instead, he reached out slowly, brushing his fingers lightly against Kyle's wrist as it rested on the edge of the sink. The touch was gentle, like testing the surface of water. But it sent a ripple through Kyle's entire body. His breath hitched, Chris's fingers lingered, tracing the bone of his wrist, his pulse. Kyle turned toward him fully now, heart in his throat. They stood inches apart. "This is probably a bad idea," Kyle whispered. Chris's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel like one." Chris nodded slowly. "No, it doesn't." Kyle didn't know who leaned in first. Maybe it was both of them at once. But suddenly Chris was there, closer than should be allowed, and Kyle could feel his breath brush against his lips. Not touching yet, but near enough that the anticipation burned hotter than any kiss could. The sound of the bathroom door opening upstairs shattered the moment like glass dropped in a quiet room. Chris stepped back, only a little, but enough. His hand slipped away from Kyle's wrist. His eyes, however, didn't leave him. "We should—" Kyle started, voice rough. Chris nodded. "Yeah, Matt's coming." Kyle turned back to the sink as if nothing had happened. Chris picked up the towel again, drying a glass that didn't need drying. Matt walked in a second later, fresh from the shower, hair damp, smiling. "Man, you guys didn't even leave me any fries?" Kyle laughed. Too loud, too forced. "You took too long." But even as they fell back into their usual rhythm, the energy in the room had changed. Something had been touched, awakened, and no matter how normal the night tried to pretend to be, it couldn't unburn what had sparked in those few quiet minutes between them. When Kyle left that night, Chris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him go. No words passed between them, but their eyes said enough. The following days passed like a dream Kyle couldn't wake from. Nothing on the surface had changed. He still texted Matt, still swung by the house to hang out, still sat at the kitchen counter sipping iced tea while Matt played video games. But now, every time Chris walked through the door, Kyle's entire body went tense, alert, like a wire pulled tight between them, humming with something unspeakable. He told himself to ignore it. Told himself it had been a moment, a mistake, a heat-of-the-moment reaction to something confusing and unspoken. But every time their eyes met, Kyle knew it wasn't just him. He saw it in Chris's gaze, the way it would linger too long, like it was trying to memorize him. The way his voice changed when he spoke only to him. Lower, slower. One night, Matt invited Kyle to stay over. They hadn't had a proper sleepover in years, but the familiarity of it made it feel innocent, harmless. They watched movies until late. Chris had gone to bed early, or so Kyle thought. Around midnight, Matt passed out mid-sentence, face buried in a pillow, the TV still playing on mute. Kyle sat on the edge of the bed in sweatpants and a white tank top, scrolling his phone mindlessly, the glow lighting his face in the dark. He got up to get water. The house was silent. The kind of stillness that only came late at night, when everything had finally stopped moving. The kitchen was dimly lit by the light above the stove, the countertops casting long shadows. Kyle opened the fridge quietly and poured himself a glass. He turned to set it down. Chris was there. Leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, shirtless, pajama pants hanging low on his hips, his skin glowed faintly in the soft yellow light, chest rising and falling slowly, his eyes locked onto Kyle's like he'd been waiting for him. Kyle's breath caught. He hadn't heard a single footstep. "Didn't mean to scare you," Chris said, voice husky with sleep or something deeper. "You didn't?" Kyle lied. Chris stepped into the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Kyle nodded. "Me neither." They stood a few feet apart, the air between them thick, heavy with all the words they hadn't said. Kyle couldn't stop looking. At the curve of Chris's collarbone, the line of muscle down his torso, the glint of light off his throat as he swallowed. Chris stepped closer. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, voice quiet. "About you. About what almost happened." Kyle's pulse thundered in his ears. It didn't happen. Chris tilted his head. "Only because we were interrupted." Kyle's breath quickened. "We shouldn't be talking about this." "But we are," Chris said. "Because you're still here." Kyle's hand tightened around the glass. "Matt's upstairs." Chris nodded. "And you're down here, with me." The silence that followed was unbearable. It stretched between them, thick with heat and longing. Then Chris moved closer again, slow, deliberate, his fingers brushing against Kyle's wrist, that same spot from before, that same spark. "You feel it too," he whispered. Kyle couldn't deny it. Not when every nerve in his body lit up at the touch, not when his skin buzzed with awareness. "I shouldn't," he said, barely breathing. "But you do." Chris's hand slipped lower, fingers grazing over Kyle's as he took the glass from him and set it gently on the counter. The moment felt suspended in time, fragile, dangerous, and yet somehow inevitable. Then Chris's hand returned, resting against Kyle's chest, just over his heart. Kyle froze. His breath caught somewhere between his throat and his lungs. The heat of that touch spread outward, slow and consuming. "You're trembling," Chris whispered. "I don't know what I'm doing," Kyle replied. Their faces were inches apart now, breath mingling in the still air. Kyle could see the faint lines at the corner of Chris's mouth, the curve of his lips, the storm behind his steady eyes. His heart pounded. He didn't pull away. And then, without warning, Chris leaned in and kissed him. Softly, slowly, like a secret that had waited too long to be told. Kyle's body answered before his mind could catch up. His lips parting, hands gripping the edge of the counter as the world around them dissolved. Every nerve ignited, every breath stolen. There was nothing hesitant in the way Chris touched him now. Nothing uncertain in the way Kyle responded. It was a kiss full of all the things they hadn't dared say. When they finally pulled apart, they stood breathless, foreheads nearly touching. Chris whispered, "We crossed a line." Kyle nodded. "I know." Kyle closed his eyes, his chest tight, full of something that felt too big to contain. "Neither do I." And then, upstairs, footsteps. They froze. Chris stepped back just in time as Matt's voice called sleepily from the hallway. "Kyle, you still up?" Kyle's voice cracked when he answered. "Yeah, just getting water." Chris grabbed the glass and handed it to him. Their hands brushed, neither smiled, nothing needed to be said. The damage was done. The next morning was all sunshine and small talk. Chris stood at the stove flipping pancakes, his expression easy, composed, like the night before had vanished into fog. Matt chatted beside him, barefoot and half awake, making jokes about syrup and bad dreams. Kyle sat at the kitchen island, nursing coffee he didn't taste, trying to make his hands stop trembling. He could still feel Chris's mouth on his, still hear the low sound of breath caught between them, still feel the weight of what they'd done hovering just beneath the surface of every word that went unspoken. Matt's voice faded in and out. Kyle nodded when he needed to, laughed when it felt right. But his mind was back in the dark of that kitchen, in the seconds before everything changed. Kyle barely touched his food. By early afternoon, he made some excuse about needing to head home. Matt offered him a lazy hug and disappeared into his room. Chris followed Kyle out onto the porch, The sun was harsh and hot on the back of Kyle's neck. "You're okay?" Chris asked quietly, once the door clicked shut behind them. Kyle exhaled. "I don't know." Chris stepped closer, not touching him this time, but close enough to make Kyle's skin buzz. "We shouldn't have, but I can't say I'm sorry." Chris's jaw tightened slightly. "Maybe I don't know either. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. Not since that first night." Kyle closed his eyes for a moment. "You're Matt's dad." Chris nodded slowly. "I know what this looks like. I know the lines we've crossed. But I'm not going to lie and pretend I don't feel what I feel, and I don't think you should either." The heat between them was unbearable now. More than sunlight. More than guilt. It was something alive. Kyle swallowed hard. What happens now? Chris looked at him, eyes shadowed but clear. "That's up to you?" Kyle didn't answer. He just walked down the steps into his car, heart slamming against his ribs. Chris watched him go, arms crossed, face unreadable. Over the next few days, Kyle avoided Matt's house. He ignored texts, let calls go unanswered. He told himself he needed space, time. But space didn't help, time didn't dull anything. The memory only sharpened. The kiss played on repeat, the feel of Chris's hand on his chest, the way the world had stopped for that one breathless moment. They haunted him. On the fourth night, there was a knock on his front door. When he opened it, Chris stood there a little out of breath, eyes darker than Kyle had ever seen them. "I shouldn't be here," Chris said. "You are," Kyle whispered. Chris looked past him, then back into his eyes. "I needed to see you." Kyle didn't move aside. He didn't have to. Chris stepped in anyway. The door closed behind them. Neither of them spoke. The silence pressed close, humming, alive with what couldn't be said. And then Chris reached out, slowly, brushing his hand down Kyle's arm. It was such a simple touch, but it cracked something open. Kyle closed his eyes. The air shifted. Everything slowed. "I don't know what this is," Chris murmured, "but it's real." Kyle opened his eyes. "It's too much." Chris nodded, and not enough. This time there was no interruption, no one else home, no reason to hold back. Chris leaned in, pressing his forehead gently against Kyle's. Their breaths mingled, ragged. And then he kissed him again, deeper, longer, with something that felt like a confession. Kyle's hands found Chris's chest, fingers clutching fabric, anchoring himself in the storm. The kiss burned through him, slow and hot, until he felt like he couldn't breathe without it. When they pulled apart, both of them were shaking. Chris whispered, "Tell me to leave, and I will." Kyle stared at him, chest rising and falling fast, but he didn't say a word. He reached for Chris again, pulled him close, because something had already shifted between them, something permanent. They didn't speak for a long time after that. Words would have only gotten in the way. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, pulsing with everything that had been building since that first touch in the kitchen. They moved like they were caught in gravity, orbiting closer with every moment, pulled together by something neither of them could name, but both felt in their bones. And he did the unthinkable. He let himself believe it. Chris whispered his name like it was something precious, something breakable. And Kyle looked up into his face, into those dark eyes full of storm and heat, and something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. "This isn't just a passing thing," Chris said. "At least not for me." Kyle swallowed, his throat tight. "Then what is it?" The simplicity of it, no labels, no justifications, hit Kyle like a wave. And then he was leaning forward, forehead against Chris's shoulder, grounding himself in the warm, steady presence of the man in front of him. They stood like that for a while, pressed close, breathing in sync, as if the room had folded in around them. Time blurred. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting everything in gold and shadow. Eventually, Chris pulled back just enough to meet Kyle's eyes again. "What happens when Matt finds out?" he asked, his voice quiet. Kyle exhaled sharply. "I don't know. I'm terrified." The idea of telling Matt made Kyle's stomach knot with fear. But the alternative, keeping this locked away in secret, felt worse. It would rot everything from the inside out. "Give me some time," Kyle said. "Let me figure out how." Chris nodded. "You'll have it. No pressure, just don't disappear again." "I won't," Kyle said, and meant it. The door closed quietly behind Chris. Kyle leaned against it, breath caught in his chest, heart pounding. The room felt different now, like it had been marked by something real. The following week unfolded carefully, deliberately. Kyle didn't go to Matt's house. He didn't reply to every text. He needed space, not from Matt, but from the guilt that nipped at the edge of this new, electric thing. But Chris stayed in his orbit. They exchanged short messages, glances when they crossed paths. Everything was quieter now, but deeper. And then came the night Kyle knew had to happen. Matt had invited him over again, just like old times. They ordered pizza, played a few rounds of a card game they barely remembered the rules to. It was easy, familiar. But Kyle's chest was tight the whole time. He could feel the weight of truth pressing in from all sides. After dinner, Matt went to grab something from the garage. Chris stepped into the kitchen, backlit by the hallway light. The same kitchen, the same quiet tension. "You gonna tell him tonight?" Chris asked. Kyle nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, I think I have to." Chris walked closer, stopping just short of touching. "Whatever happens," he said gently, "I don't regret this." "You?" Kyle shook his head. "No." Chris gave him a small, quiet smile, the kind that said more than words ever could. Footsteps, Matt returned, tossing a screwdriver onto the table and laughing at something dumb. Kyle's heart stuttered. He looked at Chris one last time, one last long, loaded glance, and then turned to face his best friend. "Hey," Kyle said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can we talk for a second? Just the two of us." Matt frowned, sensing something shift. "Yeah, sure." They moved to the porch, just like they had 100 times before. But this time, Kyle's chest was tight with truth. His hands shook. The words felt heavy in his throat. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And it's going to sound crazy, but I need you to hear it. I need you to know it comes from a real place." Matt stared at him, confused, waiting. Kyle took a breath and jumped. They didn't speak for a while after that night. Matt had left in shock, hurt, angry. The betrayal ran deep, not because of what had happened, but because it had been hidden. Kyle understood that, respected it, and waited. Chris gave Matt space too. Let the silence be what it needed to be. But weeks later, a message came through from Matt. "I don't get it. I probably won't. But I know you, man, and I know when something's real. Just don't lie to me again and be good to him." Kyle sat on the edge of his bed, staring at those words, his throat burning. Later that night, Chris met him in the same kitchen where it had all started. No pretense, no holding back. Chris stepped forward and kissed him. No heat, no urgency. Just presence, depth, a quiet promise. And Kyle kissed him back. Because whatever this was, messy, complicated, hard, it was real. And finally, they weren't pretending anymore.